guys, it's Sam and this is my August wrap up. I'm filming in the basement, that's where my filming setup is, and I'm pretty sure there's a cricket hiding somewhere. It's been bothering me all day, but the show must go on. So I read 7 books in August, and that was like pretty low for my reading month, but I officially started my new job. I got like a lot more clients and I'm just way busier. So my reading has definitely gone down because of that. And I'm a little bit sad about that, but also August is typically like a pretty bad reading month for me anyway. So yeah, 7's like not bad. But like when I've been reading like 12, 13, 14 for a while there, it makes me feel slightly sad. But let's get into it. The first book I read in August was Ruthless Gods by Emily A. Duncan. This is a book that I've already done a full review and discussion on, so I will link that on the screen for my in-depth thoughts. This is the second book in the Something Dark and Holy trilogy, so it picks up shortly after the events of the first book, so I don't really want to go into many details, but this is a gothic YA fantasy featuring lots of like blood magic and eldritch beings, and one of the main characters is a cleric for a like pantheon of gods and is sort of considered like holy, and they're at war with another country where the other main characters are from, and those are all blood mages, so they have like a difference of opinion and stuff, and this features a villain main character romance. There are trigger warnings in here for gore, lots of blood, more than gore I would say, body horror, and especially like eye stuff. So if you're at all sensitive about eye stuff, tread lightly. This book basically featured all of the complaints that I had about the first book. I love the aesthetic of this series. Like, it is just so gothic and just so like visual in that way, but not in a way that I find it all scary. But I feel like the focus is so much on that sometimes, and of the setup of certain scenes. Like, individual scenes are so good, like individual character interactions and such, but we don't get a lot of continuity between them. We don't get a lot of connection between them. So some individual scenes between like love interests especially, and some dialogue is really good, but then I don't really see where those emotions came from, and it's hard for me to follow the motivations of the characters because we don't really get to see a lot of that content. We're told a lot instead of shown. That was again a complaint that I had in the first book. We're just told a lot about how the characters feel, about how they like have built this trust with each other that we don't actually get to see on page. So that is really frustrating for me, and also I find the plot sometimes like a tad bit confusing. Like, I just feel like we should have had more answers by now about things instead of waiting for all of it in the last book. So I'm a little about that. I wouldn't say this book completely disappointed me because I kind of went in with lower expectations than I went in with the first book, but I kind of felt the same way about it as I felt about the first book, so I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. That cricket, if you guys can hear it, is all the way over in another room of the basement, and I can't find it. I can't find it. The second book that I picked up this month was Breathe the Sky by Michelle Hazen. I received this as an ARC through NetGalley, and it's adult contemporary romance. This features 2 older characters. I believe they're about middle age, and the female character is a biologist working out in the desert to protect some wildlife on like construction sites, and the guy is a foreman for the construction site, and he's viewed as very just like grumpy and hard to work with and very difficult and kind of mean, and they end up meeting and kind of hitting it off. I actually ended up DNFing this book. Both of the characters in this book have a lot of past trauma that I just, at the point that I was reading it, like I just didn't really want to read about. She is from a very abusive relationship, physically, emotionally abusive. He has a past with his family that was also a very abusive family. His brother would like kill animals, so like that's talked about. And also like their dynamic, while like I could see it kind of growing on me, like he was just so overly grumpy and curmudgeon-y that I was like, why is she even kind of getting attracted to him? Like, it was just too much. Like, I kind of needed that to not be their dynamic if there was going to be all this like traumatic stuff too, just personally. So I ended up just DNFing this. Wasn't really for me, but if you're looking for something a little more serious, I guess, with older characters, you might want to look into this. I then read The Devouring Gray by Christine Lynn Herman. This is another book that I have done a full review and discussion on, so I'll link that on the screen. This is the first book in a young adult fantasy duology. This is a contemporary fantasy that takes place in our world and follows 3 out of the 4 families in this small town. They are the descendants of some people who trapped this like mythological beast in the woods in that area, and each family has a different kind of power that allows this, and that is like some kind of like cool paranormal power, and one of the main characters is just now re-entering the town, not having known any of the history of it. So we're learning with her everything that's going on in the town, and everything is kind of going from there. There are trigger warnings in here for lots of death of various loved ones, friends, things like that, some body horror, and also some possession if you are leery of any of that. I ended up being very surprised by this this book. I hadn't heard a lot of people talk about it, and this ended up being so fun for me. It reminded me a lot, I mention it every time, of The Covenant, which is one of my favorite horrible great movies, and just like the vibe of like creepy paranormal, but like almost like witchiness, but it's not like witchy magic, they're not witches, but like one of the families has like tarot cards that they read, and they're all like associated with a different card in the deck, and there's like necromancy and different other kinds of powers and stuff, and basically the group of kids get all kind of bonded over their trauma. Like they all have trauma of some kind, and they all recognize that in one another and bond over that. Also, this book is incredibly bi. Like almost every character in this book is bi. There's very few straights. You can like count them on one hand, and I just loved that. Like just having almost everyone be bi was just sort of wonderful. I had someone comment, I think on the review, that was like, oh, it's unrealistic that like basically everyone would be bi, and I'm like, really? Because all of the queer people I know, we all like flock together, and at least half of their friend group is queer in some way, so everyone being bi is like not actually shocking to me at all. But I enjoyed the mystery of this, and then like and learning about powers and stuff, and there are a couple of different like angsty relationships, but that's not the main focus, and it's all just very, very, again, angsty. They all have a lot of like history of pain and trauma, and I guess they're all bonding over it. I don't know. It makes it sound like really dark, but it manages to have this like air of mystery with exploring interpersonal relationships, and I really did love it. There was some stuff about like some of the side characters and stuff that didn't quite make sense to me, that kept it from being 5 stars. Also, some of the like plot points about some of the like antagonists and stuff didn't quite make sense to me either. That kept it from being 5 stars, but overall I loved the vibes of this, and I do plan to continue with this series, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then was the start of Tome Topple, and I read The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is the first book in an adult fantasy trilogy. I've already done a spoiler-free review as well as discussion on this, so I will link that on the screen. This features a plethora of trigger warnings. This features child abuse, very graphic death and violence and torture against people, particularly women and children, self-harm, rape, a self-sterilization scene, and some chronic opium use throughout. As I mentioned in my other discussions of this in various other videos, the rampant violence is really only super present in 2 chapters, because this is based on the historical events of the Sino-Japanese War, and if you aren't aware of everything that happened in that, it's the 2 chapters in particular are really focusing on those events, so that is why it is so graphic. But again, just be warned, like it is just more of a grimdark series, and there are going to be a lot of just big themes there with a lot of that violence and stuff. This follows our main character of Rin, and she is an orphan that has a very abusive foster family, and she wants to go take this test, which is a very specific test that not many people pass to get into certain colleges, and she wants to get into the most prestigious college that she wouldn't then have to pay for, and it's like a military college, and so we meet her when she's about to take this test, and everything goes from there. I loved this. I have yet to hear a very bad thing about this. Most people that haven't enjoyed this or haven't read it has been because of the trigger warnings and such, but I loved the writing in this. I love the themes explored in this. This really shows the graphicness of war, what war does to people, what generational trauma does to people and trauma, and Rin as a character has this anger and this like desire for vengeance that is so slow burning and almost cold that I really appreciate, because we have this sort of like anti-hero, anti-villain story. This is not the making of a villain, but it could be, but I don't believe that it is, and we have this character who is grappling with the horrible things that have been done to her and her country, but also knowing that she's done horrible things to others as well, and it feeling like justified, and tapping into some really big powers, because there are some gods that are a little bit more active in this world and like bestow people with abilities and such, and just like the themes that the gods explore as well, and that relationship, and just the discussion of everything really being a choice and a series of choices that got Rin to where she was by the end of the book. I just really appreciate everything about it. I love the character arcs, I loved the character interactions, it was just such a well done book, and it's also a book that takes place over numerous years, and you really do feel that passage of time. So I'm very much looking forward to the next book in this series, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I then read All Stirred Up by Brienne Moore. This was an arc from NetGalley, and this is an adult contemporary romance. This does include some triggers of death of a parent, death of a grandparent, and death of a friend, as well as some former drug use, but those aren't huge parts of the story necessarily. And this is a persuasion retelling, like Jane Austen's Persuasion, and that's one of the main reasons that I picked it up. I will always reach for a Persuasion retelling because they tend to be fairly angsty. The main female character in this is a baker, really has been like managing her family's restaurant business as it has slowly kind of buried itself in the ground. She just has recently taken on all the responsibilities of it because her dad's business partner kind of just destroyed it, and this is the last chance for her to like regain the family legacy and maintain the original restaurant that her grandfather started. So she's going to Edinburgh to run that restaurant and like get it back on its feet. And our mailman character is a famous chef who has actually been like a celebrity chef and has been touring and on TV and things like that, and he is also moving back to Edinburgh where he's from, and he is starting a restaurant there, and so they kind of end up competing, and they actually have a history together because he used to work at her grandfather's restaurant. That's where they met, and they ended up breaking up. If you know the story of Persuasion, they end up breaking up. She kind of like broke his heart, and so now he's back around and sort of feeling a little bit like vindictive and isn't really sure what exactly happened, but they still have this connection, and everything kind of goes from there. So like I said, with the Persuasion retelling, I expect more angst than I got here, and that's what made this book pretty disappointing for me. So the first 50% of the book, there's actually no interaction between the main characters. Now, I haven't read Persuasion, the original story, but I've read a ton of retellings, and what's so great about them is, typically speaking, you have a lot of these just like instances of like pining and longing and seeing each other and there being misunderstandings and like some of that. This didn't really have that. It was much more of a book that was less a romance and more of a focus on her rebuilding her family business, her relationships with her like very bizarre family who are just like very uptight and snooty and like kind of toxic. So a lot more of that and less interactions with them. The interactions with them that we got towards the end I really liked, but like we just didn't get to see much of it. So it ended up being like less of a romance book for me and more of just like a contemporary fiction, and that's not at all what I wanted, and I wanted way more pining than I got. So I ended up giving this 2 out of 5 stars. I then read The Warrior Moon by Kay Arsenal Rivera. This is the final book in the Their Bright Ascendancy trilogy, the first book being The Tiger's Daughter. And this is an adult fantasy trilogy that features the love of 2 warrior women who were born fated close together. Their mothers were best friends and also warriors, and they have just basically been like prophesied to be gods and take down like the demon rulers in this fantasy world. There are trigger warnings in here for lots of gore and violence and body horror. This is basically the final culmination of the series, and this whole series we've been working towards kind of plot-wise seeing what's going to happen with the fantasy elements, because the first 2 books in the series don't have a ton of fantasy elements, and we're seeing more of the fantasy stuff, more of the battles, more of the just like culmination of all of like, are they gods? What are their powers? Things like that. This series is actually much less about the fantasy and much more about these 2 characters' relationship. These are 2 warrior women in love, have been in love like their entire lives, and it's really about their relationship more than anything, and everything else is more of like a backdrop for their relationship, and that's what's kind of frustrating about this series. This is a very like flowery written, verbose series and narration style that I just feel like a lot of things could be said so much clearer, and we could have actually had much shorter of the last book. The whole series could have probably been shorter. There's a lot that could have been cut out and condensed because I just found myself meandering through this story, and I liked a lot of things that happened in here, a lot of the themes we explored about like godhood and, you know, what you owe to people and being a ruler and being a lover and being in a family and like all this stuff. And a lot of the fantasy elements are like really cool, but we don't get to see quite enough of them. We got to see more of it, I would say, in the second half of this book, but the fact that we had to wait through like 2.5 books before we got like real fantasy stuff is super disappointing. But the stuff we did get is good, and like I'm bitter because I'm like, this could have been so much better, and we could have still had a really good focus on the relationship and the sapphic romance without it being like the only focus. Like, it could have been much more balanced than it was. Also, this last book adds in a lot of other different perspectives. For the first 2 books, we've only gotten the 2 main characters, but this book added in other perspectives for other characters that we've never followed to like add in more about the world and like the political things that are going on. But I'm just like, I don't care. And that again added way more length to this than there needed to be. So again, this book was like sometimes overly focused on one thing, sometimes too broad. It just wasn't like organized enough for me. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. And lastly, I read Well Played by Jen DeLuca. This is also a book I got from NetGalley. It comes out this month, and this is a adult contemporary romance, and it takes place in the same world as Well Met, which is one of my favorite romance books. So this takes place in a small town that holds a Ren Fair festival every year, and everything kind of revolves around the Ren Fair. So this features one of the friends of the main character of the last book, and she is kind of somebody somebody who's been a townie her entire life. She's always been in the Ren Fair, and she's feeling very stuck at the beginning of the book. And in some of her like kind of sadness and wallowing, she ends up messaging one of the guys that she frequently hooks up with every fair who's part of a band, and he's just kind of like a fuckboy. And she ends up messaging him, and he ends up responding, but it doesn't seem like it's him. And the synopsis makes very clear that who she's talking to is not who she thinks she's talking to, and they end up forming this like romantic bond and everything goes from there. So what was frustrating about this book is it is made very clear, both, like I said, in the synopsis and just you as the reader, that like she's not talking to who she thinks she's talking to. But this whole situation goes on for half of the book. So we have most of the stuff not happening at the Ren Fair, which is not the whole appeal of the book, but like it's very much framed as like this is a Ren Fair story, and like it's kind of not in the second book. And then this like catfishing situation basically is going on for half of the book, and you as readers like know it's going on and you know who it is, and she just like doesn't. So that's really frustrating. And then once she figures it out, it's both forgiven fairly quickly, but then we don't get to see much of their relationship, like of the two characters once they do figure everything out. And that's like what I wanted. Like that's during the Ren Fair period, that's getting to see them like bonding and stuff. We just had a lot of like, oh, and then we hung out all week, and it's like, I don't get to see this. And then the like wrap up of the story I felt like was also a little bit too easy. Like the solutions to the problems, I felt like her as a character, she was like less fully formed than the characters in the first book. Like I feel like she was much more like reactionary and is getting more pulled along and feels less independent, and the solutions to her problems are more wrapped up in other people than her having a lot of agency and doing things for herself, and I wanted her to do more of that. So I didn't love this one, obviously. I still pulled for the relationship. I really just do love Jen DeLuca's writing. I do find everything so cute, but there was also too much of the first couple in this book. Like I saw too much of them again. I'm like, I don't need to see you, like, which is why I don't love romance series a ton, because I'm like, I don't want to see the other couple. I know some people do, but like I don't tend to like it. And then this couple was like cute but not my favorite, and the situations that were happening were just like not my favorite, but I still like love the writing. And I'm also very excited for the final book in the series and the characters that's going to feature, because that was hinted in the first book. There's more hints in this book, and I'm like extra invested in that. So I still like this world, but didn't love it as much as I loved Well Met, and I gave this one 2.5 to 3 stars. So that is it for my August wrap up. Comment down below, let me know what you read this month. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.